why the mind rushes to a verdict. Consider this carefully before anything else. What troubles you is not the event itself, but the judgment you place upon it. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of how the mind operates. An event occurs. It is neutral. It has no opinion about you, no intention, no verdict attached. And yet disturbance appears almost instantly, as if it were built into the situation. It feels automatic. It feels unavoidable. This is where most people stop thinking. They assume that because judgment appears quickly, it must be forced upon them. They speak as if the world injects meaning directly into their mind. But this is a mistake. Speed is not the same as compulsion. Familiarity is not the same as necessity. The Stoic claim is simple and demanding: nothing outside you has the authority to decide how you experience it. That authority belongs to your faculty of judgment. If disturbance arises, it is because a judgment has been made and accepted, not because the event required it. This is uncomfortable to hear because it removes excuses. You cannot outsource responsibility to circumstances, to other people, or to your past. If judgment creates disturbance, then judgment is also where freedom begins. This does not mean you control impressions. They arrive on their own. But it does mean you are responsible for what you do with them. Hold this distinction. Everything that follows depends on one clear distinction. Most people believe they are reacting to life as it happens. In reality, they are reacting to what they think belongs to them. This is why judgment feels automatic. The mind is constantly trying to defend territory it assumes is under its authority. You assume outcomes are yours. You assume other people's behavior is yours to manage. You assume recognition, timing, fairness, and cooperation fall under your control. When any of these fail to align with your expectations, judgment fires instantly. The reaction feels justified because the assumption was never questioned. This confusion begins early. You are rewarded for results, praised for approval, and corrected for outcomes you only partially influence. Over time, the mind blends effort with ownership. It forgets where its authority ends. By adulthood, most people no longer distinguish between what they can influence and what they can command. Stoic discipline begins by drawing that line sharply. What belongs to you is limited but absolute. Your judgments, your intentions, your choices, your use of reason. These are fully yours. No one can reach into them unless you permit it. Everything else, events, outcomes, other people's reactions, reputation, delays, mistakes, accidents, exists outside that boundary. When this division is unclear, judgment rushes in to compensate. The mind reacts quickly because it believes something has been taken from it. It feels invaded. That sense of violation is what produces urgency and emotional force. Consider a simple example. Someone speaks to you curtly. If you assume their tone reflects your worth, judgment appears instantly: disrespect, insult, threat. If you recognize that their behavior belongs to them, the same words arrive with far less disturbance. The impression is identical. The ownership claim is different. Or consider delay. A message is not answered. If you believe response time is owed to you, judgment forms immediately: disregard, rejection, incompetence. If you recognize that another person's schedule is not yours to govern, the delay remains a fact, not an offense. The speed of judgment comes from habit, not necessity. The mind has practiced confusing ownership for years. It reacts quickly because it has rehearsed the error repeatedly. This is why telling yourself to stay calm fails. Calm is not produced by force. It is produced by clarity. Until the boundary of control is precise, judgment will continue to misfire. The mind cannot remain still while it believes something essential is under threat. This distinction also explains why people feel exhausted by discipline. They attempt to regulate emotions while continuing to claim authority over what they cannot control. This creates constant friction. Effort is applied in the wrong direction. Responsibility is misassigned. Stoic discipline does not ask you to accept less. It asks you to accept accurately. When you stop demanding control over what is not yours, judgment slows naturally. There is less to defend, less to correct, less to resist. The mind begins to conserve its energy for what actually falls within its command. This is not resignation. It is precision. Judgment feels automatic because the boundary has been blurred. Restore the boundary, and the mechanism becomes visible. You begin to see where reaction originates, and where it does not need to. The boundary is now clear. The mechanism that follows it must still be examined. Now we look at what actually creates disturbance. Between what happens and how you react, there is a moment that usually goes unnoticed. This moment is not dramatic. It is quiet, fast, and familiar. Because it passes so quickly, most people deny it exists at all. But this is precisely where judgment takes form. The Stoics describe this sequence with precision. First, an impression appears. A sound, a thought, a memory, a facial expression, a delay. Impressions arrive automatically. You do not choose them. You cannot prevent them from arising. In this sense, the mind is passive at the start. The mistake is to assume the process ends there. An impression is only a proposal. It presents itself as if it were already true. This is bad. This is unfair. This means something about me. But it has no authority on its own. Authority enters only when you agree. This agreement is what the Stoics called assent. Assent is not loud. It does not announce itself. It feels like recognition, not decision. The thought appears, and the mind nods along without examination. That nod is the turning point. Once assent is given, judgment is complete, and disturbance follows as a consequence. This is why judgment feels automatic. Not because assent is impossible to refuse, but because it is rarely noticed. Consider criticism. Someone offers a remark about your work. The impression arrives immediately: threat, exposure, inadequacy. If assent follows without pause, the body tightens, the mind rehearses defenses, resentment forms. The reaction feels inevitable. But inevitability is an illusion created by speed. Or consider misunderstanding. A message is interpreted the wrong way. The impression says, "They meant this." Assent turns interpretation into certainty. Emotion follows certainty, not ambiguity. Yet the impression never proved its claim. It was simply accepted. The Stoic distinction here is exact: impressions are involuntary, assent is not. Feeling the pull of a thought is not the same as agreeing with it. Emotion can arise before agreement, but it does not require continuation. What sustains disturbance is the judgment that the impression is accurate and demands response. Most people collapse feeling and agreement into a single event. They say, "I felt angry, so I was angry." The Stoic correction is subtle but decisive: you felt an impulse, then you endorsed a conclusion. This endorsement can be interrupted. Not with suppression. Not with argument. With recognition. The pause before assent does not need to be long. One breath is sufficient. The purpose is not to eliminate impressions, but to prevent automatic consent. This is where freedom exists in practice, not theory. You cannot stop the mind from producing suggestions. But you can refuse to sign off on them blindly. Each time you notice an impression and delay agreement, you weaken the habit that makes judgment feel compulsory. This also explains why insight alone changes nothing. Understanding the concept without practicing the pause leaves the mechanism intact. The mind continues to assent at full speed. Knowledge arrives too late, after judgment has already hardened. Training begins by slowing recognition, not by changing conclusions. You learn to see the impression as an impression. You remind yourself that clarity does not require urgency. You allow the moment of assent to become visible. This is not passivity. It is restraint. and restraint is an active use of reason. Once you see where assent occurs, judgment no longer appears mysterious. It appears mechanical. And what is mechanical can be trained. Understanding the mechanism is necessary, but it is not sufficient. It must be practiced under pressure. Force and discipline are often confused. When people hear that judgment must be trained, they imagine pressure. They imagine clenching the mind, suppressing reactions, or enduring discomfort until it fades. This misunderstanding is the reason discipline feels exhausting and unsustainable. It is treated as resistance rather than preparation. Stoic discipline is not the act of overpowering impulses in the moment they arise. That approach arrives too late. By the time force is applied, assent has usually already been given. The judgment is already formed, and the body is reacting to a conclusion it believes is true. Discipline works earlier than that. Training, in the Stoic sense, is the repeated shaping of attention before pressure appears. It is not about winning internal battles. It is about reducing the number of battles that occur at all. You do not wait for chaos and then demand calm. You rehearse clarity so that chaos has less authority when it arrives. This is why willpower fails. Willpower assumes that the decisive moment occurs at peak intensity. But judgment feels automatic precisely because it has been practiced thousands of times without examination. Trying to overpower a habit at full speed is inefficient and unreliable. Training works by slowing the process upstream. You train yourself to notice impressions earlier. You train yourself to label them accurately. This is an impression, not a verdict. You train yourself to tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty without rushing to resolution. Over time, the mind stops treating every impression as an emergency. Consider how physical skills are learned. No one waits until a crisis to learn balance. Balance is trained in low-stakes conditions until it becomes stable. The same applies here. The mind must practice withholding assent when the cost is small, so that restraint is available when the cost feels high. Discipline is not punishment for reacting poorly. It is preparation to react less. This also corrects another error, the belief that Stoic discipline aims to remove emotion. It does not. Emotions arise naturally from impressions. What changes is their duration and authority. When assent is withheld, emotions pass without being reinforced by narrative and justification. You still feel the initial surge. What you do not add is the story that extends it. People often abandon discipline because they expect immediate silence inside the mind. When that silence does not appear, they conclude the practice is failing. In reality, the practice is working precisely when you notice how quickly the mind wants to conclude. Noticing the impulse without obeying it is the training. Repetition matters more than intensity. A single dramatic effort changes nothing. Small, consistent acts of restraint reshape the habit of assent. Each time you pause, even briefly, you interrupt the reflex that makes judgment feel inevitable. This is why Stoic texts emphasize practice over insight. Insight explains the mechanism. Practice alters it. Discipline, then, is not force applied against yourself. It is alignment with how the mind actually works. You stop demanding instant perfection. You train recognition. You accept gradual refinement. When discipline is understood this way, effort decreases. There is less internal conflict, less self-reproach. The work becomes precise rather than heroic. Training remains abstract unless it appears in daily life. This practice is proven in ordinary moments. Most people look for discipline in extremes. They wait for conflict, loss, or pressure to test their composure. But by then, the habit of assent is already in motion. Ordinary moments are where judgment is trained because they are where it usually goes unnoticed. Daily life supplies a constant stream of impressions. Minor delays, small inconveniences, offhand remarks. These seem insignificant, which is precisely why they matter. The mind practices judgment here without resistance. It rehearses irritation, entitlement, and assumption when the stakes feel low. Over time, these rehearsals become automatic. Stoic practice reverses this process deliberately. The first practice is anticipating impressions without anxiety. This does not mean imagining worst-case scenarios. It means acknowledging, accurately, that inconvenience will occur. People will be distracted. Plans will shift. Communication will be imperfect. When these impressions arrive as expected visitors rather than violations, the mind is less eager to judge them as wrong. Expectation shapes reaction. When you expect friction, you do not interpret it as an offense. The second practice is pausing before assent. This pause does not require silence or analysis. One breath is enough. The purpose is not to decide immediately what is true, but to notice that a decision is being proposed. You create a small gap between impression and agreement. In that gap, you remind yourself, this is an appearance, not a conclusion. This pause is easiest to practice when the impulse is mild. Waiting in line. Reading an ambiguous message. Hearing a casual comment. These moments offer repetition without cost. Each pause weakens the reflex to agree automatically. Over time, the pause becomes available even when the impression carries emotional weight. The third practice is evening review without guilt or praise. At the end of the day, you examine where assent was given too quickly and where restraint appeared. This is not a moral judgment. Guilt is itself an unexamined judgment about failure. Praise is often an unexamined judgment about identity. The review is diagnostic, not evaluative. You note patterns. You observe where impressions consistently trigger agreement. You recognize where the pause was skipped and where it appeared naturally. This quiet review trains awareness without adding another layer of judgment to correct. What matters is consistency, not performance. The mind changes through repeated exposure to clarity, not through condemnation. These practices work together. Anticipation reduces surprise. The pause interrupts habit. Review consolidates learning. None of them require force. None of them depend on mood. They rely on attention applied repeatedly to small events. This is why Stoic discipline does not demand withdrawal from life. It requires closer contact with it. The day becomes the training ground. Ordinary moments become opportunities to refine judgment. When practiced steadily, something shifts. Reactions lose their urgency. Impressions still arrive, but they no longer demand immediate agreement. The mind begins to conserve its energy. It stops treating every suggestion as a command. This is not emotional numbness. It is precision. Consistency produces a different result. Freedom is often misunderstood. Most people associate freedom with ease, with favorable conditions, with the absence of friction. When difficulty appears, they assume freedom has been reduced. From a Stoic perspective, this confusion is the source of persistent dissatisfaction. Freedom is not the removal of challenge. It is the stability of judgment in the presence of challenge. When judgment feels automatic, life feels coercive. Events appear to dictate inner state. Mood rises and falls with outcomes. This is not because life is unusually harsh, but because authority has been placed in the wrong location. Stoic freedom begins when authority is returned inward. This does not make life smoother. Delays still occur. People still disappoint. Plans still fail. What changes is the point at which disturbance is decided. The mind no longer treats external friction as a verdict about itself. It recognizes events as events, not commands. This is why Stoic freedom is quiet. It does not announce itself. There is no dramatic sense of relief. Instead, there is a reduction in internal urgency. Fewer situations feel personal. Fewer impressions demand immediate resolution. Comfort seeks conditions. Freedom seeks command. Comfort depends on alignment between desire and outcome. When that alignment breaks, comfort disappears. Freedom does not depend on alignment. It depends on the capacity to withhold assent when impressions are misleading. This is also why freedom must be maintained rather than achieved. There is no permanent state where judgment no longer requires attention. Each day presents new impressions. Each day requires the same restraint. Authority must be exercised repeatedly or it weakens. Nothing external needs to improve for this to begin. Circumstances do not need to change. The practice does not wait for permission. It begins the moment you recognize that judgment is an activity, not a reflex imposed upon you. This recognition alters responsibility. You stop asking whether life is fair enough to deserve calm. You stop waiting for others to behave correctly before you respond correctly. You stop negotiating with events. You return to what is yours. Freedom, in this sense, is not comforting. It does not promise ease. It promises clarity. It promises that disturbance will no longer be mistaken for inevitability. It promises that your inner state will no longer be decided by speed alone. When judgment slows, freedom appears not as a feeling, but as a function. You notice choice where there was once compulsion. You notice space where there was once reaction. That space is small. It must be protected. It must be practiced. But it cannot be taken from you unless you surrender it. Nothing more needs to be added. Nothing here requires escalation. Judgment feels automatic because it has been practiced without interruption. That is the simplest and most demanding conclusion. There is no external force compelling agreement. There is no hidden mechanism beyond your faculty of assent. What has been repeated has become familiar. What is familiar has been mistaken for necessity. Responsibility rests precisely here. This does not mean you will never react quickly. It does not mean impressions will stop arriving with force. Perfection is not the standard, and failure is not an exception. The Stoic position is quieter than that. It states only that responsibility cannot be transferred. Each judgment is either examined or accepted. Each assent is either delayed or given. No one else can do this work for you. When disturbance appears, it is an invitation to locate where agreement occurred. Not to condemn yourself. Not to justify the reaction. To observe the mechanism honestly. The moment you see that judgment was added, the event loses its authority to define you. This is why Stoic discipline does not promise comfort. It promises ownership. You may still feel frustration, disappointment, or tension. But you no longer confuse these with commands. You no longer build identity or narrative around them. You allow impressions to pass without granting them control over your reason. The work is repetitive. It returns daily. It appears in small moments that seem unimportant. That is where it must be practiced. Not to achieve a state, but to maintain clarity. Nothing outside you needs to improve for this responsibility to remain yours. Circumstances do not vote on your judgment. Other people do not approve or deny your assent. What is yours remains yours as long as you claim it deliberately. The work is simple. It is not easy. And it is yours. Return to the pause.